Okay, so I will get started. Today is a really exciting day for me. Ephraim has been such an important part of my, I guess, artistic upbringing or success as an artist. I can probably actually pin a lot of my skills and, well, most of my painting skills actually on Ephraim. He was my first painting teacher at Maryland Institute College of Art back in 2000, and I had him all 4 years. Did you leave in 2004 too?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you were my senior thesis in 2004. So Ephraim's entire time at Maryland Institute College of Art was my entire time. So I think there's something in the stars on that one. But prior to that, a little bit about Ephraim's background. He was born in Brooklyn and went to Columbia University, where he got a BA in art history. So a lot of his knowledge, I think, about art and his passion for art really stemmed from his art history background. But he went on to get an MFA from Columbia University in their School of Fine Art following his BA. His education really didn't just end at Columbia. He also worked in the Brooklyn Museum of Fine Art under Francis Cunningham, the National Academy of Design under Harvey Dinnerstein, and the Art Students League with Robert Beverly Hale. All of this education and honing of his skills led to incredible exhibitions. His webpage says 11 one-person exhibitions in New York, but I actually counted 12. So you might want to look into that. But also exhibiting at places like the Butler Institute of American Art, the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, the Mayer Museum of Art, and the National Academy of Design. Like I said, Ephraim has been an incredible teacher, probably influencing far more artists than I could even count. But he also taught, aside from Maryland Institute College of Art, at the Rhode Island School of Design. And I don't know, do you still continue to work at Art Students League, or are you officially retired?
I'm sort of semi-retired, so I'm not doing a regular class, but I do all sorts of workshops. Yeah.
Yeah. So doing lots of workshops at Art Students League, which is of course the iconic New York art school. And I also wasn't sure if you were still doing or working with the medical students actually, and doing the anatomy and things like that.
Yeah. No, I stopped that, but I did that for 11 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited to have Ephraim here today. So I'm going to actually pass it over to him and actually pull up the slideshow. So give me 1 second.
Well, thank you all very much. And thank you particularly to Jordan. That was a very kind introduction. And Jordan's a tremendous asset to y'all's community. I mean, the amount of things he does and the energy and intensity that he brings to everything is palpable. So you're really lucky to have him. Anyway, I'm delighted to talk a little bit this morning. I was going to say thank you all for coming out in the rain, but we're all at home. So anyway, I'll talk a little bit about things that I've been working on recently, and then afterwards, I'd like to take any questions that you have. So I've been painting a lot recently, paintings that came out of my travels. And as most of you probably experience, traveling is a tremendous inspiration, and it really gets you going because it makes you see things in a really different way. And you're sort of assaulted with shapes and colors and arrangements that you're just not used to. And many of them are much more beautiful than the places that you might live. So it's really a wonderful thing. Another thing I thought of was when you go through Europe, particularly smaller towns, you realize what it's like to live without the absolute omnipresence of automobiles. And you can go to places where people walk everywhere and you don't look at cars and parking lots and things like that all the time. So that appeals to me. Anyway, this is a town in Burgundy called Semur en Auxerre. And I remember driving into this town. There I say, well, you do drive in. and seeing this town that was just sort of built into the side of a mountain, and it had so many different eras depicted in its architecture. It was like looking at the rings of a tree. You know, that bridge that's in the foreground, I think the next one is a detail of that, Jordan. Yeah, that bridge was built by the Normans in like 900. And then there's a tower that was built in 1100, and there's a Gothic cathedral, and then there are 19th century mansions and things like that. And seeing all of these, each time period has a different shape. You know, some will favor triangles, some will favor cones, some will favor very straight angles, things like that. And to see them all chock-a-block together, to me, was tremendously exciting. And of course, when you get a nice canal like this that reflects everything, reflections are, you know, formally are a beautiful way to compose things. So anyway, my usual MO is when I go over to Europe and paint, I go and I do small studies, you know, maybe 8 by 10, 9 by 12, something like that. Whatever I can fit into a small portfolio case and put in overhead luggage, because I don't like to, you know, check a suitcase with all my paintings that I've been working on for fear of losing them. But anyway, I do small studies over there and drawings, and then I come home and I elaborate on them into much larger compositions. Like this one is about 30 by 42, I would say. So obviously that's not something that I could do over there in a short period of time. But what I find is that if I do some small color studies, do some drawings, and then take photographs, I can use all of those three things together. And of course, my memory and my experience of having been there is very important. I can usually reconstruct what I'm interested in. So you all probably realize the limitations of photographs, right? I mean, first of all, they never get the color right. They're also distort the space. In other words, we're binocular, but a photograph is monocular. So things seem to recede much faster in a photograph. If you have two things, one in front of the other, and you look at them, it'll look one way. But if you take a photograph of it, it'll seem like the back one is much, much farther away. And so also, you know, buildings that are standing up straight will tend to do this in photographs. So you have to also make some drawings of your subject. That is, if you're interested in getting the reality of the thing. There are painters, and they're called photorealists, who really want to paint what the world looks like in photographs. My interest in photographs is to help me get it the way the world looks, I think, to the naked eye. So anyway, that's kind of the way I put all these things together. All right, let's go to the next one, I think is that detail. And then this is a detail just of the little bit of ledge that's to the right-hand side, lower right-hand side in the painting. If you want to go back one more to the full one, there you go. You see it, that whole section against the right-hand edge of the painting. That's the top of this, yep. And I wanted to show you a detail of that because I was really working hard to get the texture and the feel of old stone that had lichens and moss on it and things like that. So what I did was I basically blocked it in, and then I taped it off with masking tape and paper. And then I started like taking a wet paintbrush and flicking it on it and splattering and doing all kinds of things until I built up the texture that appealed. And of course, I had to protect the rest of the painting because I didn't want splatters all over the place. But that, as Jordan was talking about wax resist drawing before, that's a technique that I use in wax resist drawing. So I figured, well, I can exploit that in the painting. All right, next.
Was that done in acrylic or oil?
Oil. All of these paintings are oil paintings. And I will, I think towards the end, show you a couple of pastels. I work in pastels as well. I do a lot of things, you know. I'm one of the few, I shouldn't say few, but a lot of artists, as they get older and they're showing in one thing and another, they paint and they paint and they paint and they stop drawing. You know, there's no market for drawings. You can't sell them usually. So you do them for yourself. And I've always loved drawing, and I draw with a lot of different media. I also, you know, paint in oils and I work in pastels. I would say those are the major things. When you're working in oil paint, you know, oil is heavy and glossy and syrupy and all of those things. And sometimes you just want something that's a little lighter fare, you know, much as in your diet. So sometimes I'll just get tired of that shiny thickness, and I'll take out my pastels and work on those. So I like to keep things alive.
Everyone, I have a quick question. When you're there and these locations and you're doing color studies, are they done in watercolor or gouache, or you're bringing oils over on the airplane?
I'm bringing my oils over, yeah, which is, you know, difficult, and it's you got to lug them around. But for me, getting it, eventually I'm thinking about doing oil painting, so I want my studies to be in oil if I can. I mean, a lot of people have very successfully made watercolor studies of things that they then built up in oils. You think about someone like Turner. Almost all of his studies of Venice were done in watercolor. But I have a hard time making that transition, because watercolor is, you know, so keyed up and it's so light and transparent, and I'd rather do the studies in the same medium that I'm thinking about working in. So yeah, it just takes some doing to bring your easel and your oil paints. But you know, the portable French easel is an extraordinary invention. I mean, the portable French easel and the advent of paint in tubes is really what made Impressionism possible. The fact that you could finally take things out into the landscape and you weren't stuck in the studio. I mean, before paint were in tubes, people stored them in glass jars or clay pots, or if you go far enough back in the Renaissance, they put them in pigs' bladders and sausage casings and things like that. And all that stuff is absolutely not portable. So getting that easel where you can put everything in the box and it also functions for you to paint on, and the paint in tubes really revolutionized everything, I think, in the late 18th, early 19th century. So, yeah. So this was actually the road that I was going down when I first saw this town. And like I said, just the layers of history and the angles of those roofs with their beautiful tiles, orange tiles on them, right next to the lush green foliage. The houses were really built into the side of the hill, and there were walls that were fortification walls and things like that. It just blew my mind. You know, I'm thinking now, later, I think about, well, you know, what is it I really love about this scene? And I can talk about, you know, the rings of a tree and all the history of things. But to tell you the truth, I've just gone by, if my heart leaps up, I see something and I go, damn, that's beautiful. That's all I need. I can figure out later why I feel that way. I may have very complex reasons for doing it. But so long as my heart leaps up and I say, I want to do this, that's good enough for me. And I've learned to trust that, in other words. Some people feel like they have to, you know, understand why they like something before they can do it. But that hasn't seemed profitable to me. Anyway, this is the other side of the bridge from the first painting that you saw. And so this one has the Gothic cathedral looming over the whole town there. And you can see one thing I hope you notice is that I've left parts of the canvas unfinished, unpainted, where you see the white of the canvas. And I've done that for several reasons. I remember when the Metropolitan Museum took over the old Whitney and they put their modern and 20th century paintings in there, they started off with a show called Unfinished. And to me, it was one of the most revolutionary exhibitions I'd ever seen. It was 500 years of paintings that were not finished for some reason or other. Either the artist lost interest, the artist died, there was a war, you know, whatever, the patron stopped paying him, blah, blah, blah. And paintings were left in all kinds of crazy states. And I thought it was the most exciting thing I had ever seen, because it was like getting this intense inside view as to how the painting was painted. And I came away thinking, God, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. You know, you can paint a million different ways, and people did. And when the painting's unfinished, you can kind of dissect what they did. They did this first, then they did this. So to me, it was absolutely eye-opening. And I loved the way that paintings looked when there was some of the original canvas left. And they had a wonderful quote from Alice Neal, the 20th century portrait painter. And she said, "I always leave some white of the canvas so that the painting can breathe." And I thought, wow, that's a really cool idea. I really like that. And another artist said, "I always leave part of the painting unfinished so that the image can escape." And I thought, again, that's a wonderful idea, because when you complete a painting, corner to corner to corner to corner, you get the sort of maximum realistic effect, but you've also pinned it down. You know, nothing else can happen. It's set in stone in that way. Whereas when something is unfinished, it could change. Different things could happen. You don't know exactly what's going to go on. And then the other thing is, again, you get an inside look at how I painted the painting. So the aspect of process is a really exciting, byproduct of that. Because you can, be looking at some of these houses and say, wow, they look so realistic. And then you move over and you go, wait, it's just paint. It's not really a house, there's just blank canvas and lines there. And how did that become, a house? So that sort of magical alchemy of oil paint and how you represent things is really brought right to the surface. So another thing I thought of was, and I'm going to show you a set of slides of how I go about painting paintings. And I realized that as I worked on paintings, there were often a number of times in the process where I thought, you know what, if I leave this painting in this state, that would look really cool. But I never really had the courage to do that. I felt somehow obligated, to finish out the image. And all of a sudden, I remember when I hit 60, I said, damn, I'm 60 years old. I can do whatever I want, And that also helped spur me, give me the confidence to do this. So let's look at the next one, Jordan. The paintings look very realistic in photographs, but when you look up close, the paint's really juicy. And in a sense, it's very abstracted. It's just that I get the right color value in the right spot. And so it looks like what it is I'm trying to represent. But there's a life to the surface that I think is really important. Okay, let's go to the next one.
I remember actually we were in a group show at the Shepherd Art Gallery. I guess I don't know if it was Still Life Gallery at the time, and you had I think you claimed it was the first painting that you left unfinished. It was a little boat kind of on the side of a river, and you were talking to somebody, and you mentioned just like, I've gotten to a point in my career where I think I'm allowing myself to actually leave something unfinished. Like, yeah, I wouldn't give myself permission to do it until now, and I thought that was just so funny.
Yeah, no, definitely. And sometimes it's just, work ethic. Sometimes it's, the gallery system exerts pressure on you to have, finished paintings to show. And then you could say, well, I put in hundreds of hours and it's not completed. You know, am I going to be wasting those hours? I mean, you have all kinds of second thoughts and doubts and things. And I think eventually you just decide to go with your gut. So, like I said, I wanted to show you how I paint my paintings, because I paint in a rather unusual way. It is not unique to me. I paint in a sort of manner that's known as color spot painting. And color spot painting goes back to the Baroque period. I mean, there's a Velasquez head in the Boston Museum of Garganza that is almost a pure color spot painting. But it was really, color spot painting was really codified and made accessible to people by Charles Hawthorne, who was an incredible American painter and a great teacher. And Hawthorne was the man who started the artist colony on Cape Cod. He started taking students out there, and he was doing something that was kind of revolutionary in the United States, not in Europe, but in the United States. And that is, he took students outside to paint what he called premier coups, or first strike. In other words, you had to do the whole painting in one shot. And he felt like that was the only way that you could really learn to control the big masses in a painting. And he took people particularly to the beach, where the sunlight was really intense. And he had people do these studies, and he said, you know, big brushes, big thoughts. He didn't want people getting lost in tiny little details. As a matter of fact, he often made people paint with their palette knives so that they just couldn't get involved with little details. And he said, unless you can organize the first, you know, 7 or 8 big spots, the painting's not going to fly. You know, it's going to get oriented this way, light or dark or warm or cool. You know, as oil painters, we all know that feeling of working on a painting and looking at it and going, damn, why is it so muddy, right? We all get trapped in muddiness, usually from over mixing things or just not being sure of what we want. So anyway, the aspect of color spot painting is that you don't put any arbitrary color down on the canvas, including an imprimatura, or the way people will coat the whole canvas with raw umber or gray or something like that and work on a middle value. Hawthorne really believed in the, you know, the primacy of the white canvas, because he said that if you put down a raw umber, aside from being in a middle tone, you've already got this brown, and every note you put down is in reference to that brown, whether you know it or not, and that brown is influencing your decision. So when you end up with a muddy painting, you might think, well, I started out with a whole canvas of mud, and maybe that had something to do with it. So anyway, the basic principles of color spot painting are that you only put down color values that are accurate, that you've seen from nature, you've abstracted them from nature. And note, please, that he calls them color values. In other words, there's 2 components, right, to observations. One is value, meaning light or dark, and the other is color, hue, chroma. And you've got to get both of those things correct. You could have the right hue, but make it too light or too dark. And conversely, you can have the right hue, you could have the right value, but be too warm or too cool, things like that. So in order to get something right, you have to juggle the value and the color at the same time. Now, the way that most people paint, let's go to the next one. Oh, and I'm sorry, let me just say one thing. So when I'm working on a complicated painting like this, I do a fairly detailed drawing ahead of time. I don't have a million details. I mean, with architecture, I feel like I want to count the number of windows. Not everybody does. If you look at a Pizarro cityscape, and Pizarro did some of the most beautiful cityscapes of Paris, the views he did from the Louvre of the Tuileries are extraordinary. I don't think he counted windows, he put down his little strokes and you got the sense. But for me, the fact that one building has 8 windows and one has 4 is important to me because it affects the way that the building looks. Anyway, I cannot really paint, meaning look at the color values, and draw at the same time. I just do not have enough gigabytes to do that. And most people I know do not have enough gigabytes to do that. Because if you get the drawing right, meaning the shape of the building, you usually drop the color. And if you go for the color, your building's, all fakak this way or that way. So to get them both together, what I do is I separate the process and I take care of the drawing first. So this drawing functions as a map for me. And this map tells me where my color values are going to go. And if you remember, that section in the lower right corner was left in this state. Okay, it didn't have color put over on top of it. So this functions as a map. Let's look at the next one. So this is how one starts a color spot painting. In other words, I look very carefully at the notes that the nature presents me with, and I try to replicate them in terms of color and value. And what I noticed immediately in a color spot painting, you want to try to go for areas of great contrast at the beginning. So the redness of those clay rooftops and the blue of the sky was such a beautiful and intense contrast that's what I wanted to start with. And those red roofs against everything else, including the green foliage, right? They're kind of complements, is something that's really important. So I started out on this particular roof, and this would be, I would say, 1 day's painting. That's probably what I could do in a good long day. And again, it looks very real, but if you get up close to it, they're just pieces of paint, I was amazed when I went to the Lopez Garcia show in Boston and saw those extraordinary, huge cityscapes that he did, how absolutely unmodulated the pieces of paints were. They were just flat pieces of color put down right next to each other, but they were so right on that it just looked like buildings, it was incredible. So anyway, this is how I would start a painting. I look for an area of great contrast and I start there.
Ephraim, could you talk a little bit about the scale of your brush? Because I remember what you were saying, Hawthorne had these, biggest brush you can for big ideas. Are you using a large brush for these little moments, these color spot moments?
No.
And also, what is the support? Are you painting on canvas or wood?
This is a piece of linen. And by the way, this painting is fairly large. It's about 42 by 60. So it's quite large, but even still, to get into those windows and to get them, with straight lines and one thing another, I can't use brushes that are too big. Again, if I was painting a premier coup or, really direct painting that I wanted to paint quickly, I would use big brushes because, again, I wouldn't want to get stuck in, how many windows are here. But I'm taking my time with this painting. This painting took me over 6 months to paint. I wasn't in a rush. I had all the time in the world, so I could start out with smaller spots. Now, I know what I'm doing. In other words, I've done this color spot painting for over 40 years. So when I pick a color value in a small spot, I know that it's pretty accurate, It takes a while to learn how to do that. You can put down, 6, 7, 8 spots, and you get back from your canvas and you look at it and they're not quite right. You know, you miss something. You made one plane too dark or one plane too cool, and you have to go back and scrape it out and put it down correctly. And that's the hard thing. It takes a lot of training to make sure that you can hit color values accurately. So anyway, I think the first day's work is absolutely crucial. It's the foundation on which the painting rests. So if I'm off with something here, like I make that roof too orangey or too red or something like that, and make the blue sky, you know, manganese rather than cobalt or something, then that initial juxtaposition is wrong. And the building, so to speak, is going to go up skewed rather than straight. So I spend a lot of time on the first couple of days getting back from it and staring at it and making sure that those initial spots are correct. And I'd say if I have a week's worth of painting and I've really interrogated it, then I know it's right and the painting's going to take care of itself, at least from my standpoint. All right, let's look at the next one. So I'm backing up again so you can see the whole thing. Here's the second day's work. I've moved over to the left because I wanted to get something dark in there, you know? So I have this second rooftop that I've put in, and it's dark and it's brown, so it distinguishes itself from the terracotta roof. And now I have some of the darker notes in the painting along with some of the lighter notes, like on the side of that building. And again, I think if at the beginning of a painting, it doesn't have to be the first day, but towards the beginning of the painting, if you can put down your lightest light, your darkest dark, your warmest warm, and your coolest cool, if they can be in the painting, that's like your baseball diamond. You've touched all the bases, and you know that nothing else will exist outside of that. So you've set up a parameter for the painting, and the painting has to exist within that parameter. You've always said, this is my lightest light, so nothing can be lighter than that. And if you're looking at something and it seems really light to you, you've got to check the lightest light that you have and make sure you're not violating that. There's a hierarchy of values, right? And you have to learn to stick with that. So what we like to say is that all paintings are in a key, like a piece of music. So you know immediately if you hear a musical piece, if it's in a minor key or a major key. That's a huge difference. And you hear it immediately. And some paintings are keyed dark. You know, think about Albert Pinkham Ryder or somebody like that. Some paintings are keyed way up light, you know, Twatman and some of the American Impressionists, Maurice Prendergast, people like that. Some are keyed warm, some are keyed cool. Think about Picasso with his rose period, right? And then his blue period, other way around, blue period first, and then his rose period. So in the blue period, everything was keyed to those dark cools. And there was a show in Washington a number of years ago of the blue period paintings. And I was so depressed when I left that exhibition. I mean, depressed in a good way. They were the saddest paintings I had ever seen. I mean, the drawing was monumental. These blue colors just spoke of melancholy and whatever. Anyway, even if there was a green or a brown in the painting, it had a lot of blue in it, you know? So he keyed the whole thing to the blue. And in the rose period, he keyed everything to this terracotta kind of color value. And then there are people who the key is wide open. You think about a Matisse, you know, red, yellow, blue, green, all over the place, versus someone like Whistler, for whom the, you know, color value range was tiny. Those tonalist painters kept everything very, very closely held, as opposed to Impressionists that opened up. So you think about each painting being in a key. And what you want to do is establish the key of the painting as quickly as you can. Because then you've got the sort of guardrails that you need, so you're not going to go off, you know, all of a sudden get too warm or too cool or something like that. All right, let's look at the next one. So it was very important, obviously, to get that green in reasonably quickly. Now, this is a couple of days work. So to get the green of the foliage against those terracotta colors was very, very important aspect of this painting. That green, orange, brown is a contrast that vibrates through the entire canvas. So I knew I needed to get to them fairly early on. Now, one thing I'd like to say is that, again, even though this is very, call it realistic, whatever, they really look like buildings, they really look like certain kinds of trees. But when I'm painting them, I don't think of them as trees or buildings or anything like that. I think of it as, you know, this kind of a green that's darker or lighter than the green next to it. And then the building is this kind of orange brown. I'm not thinking tiled roof. I'm thinking, what is that color value? And I know that if I get the color value right, it will look like a building. You know, as my teacher, Francis Cunningham, used to say, you don't paint with trees, and you don't paint with tiles, and you don't paint with clouds. You paint with oil paint on a flat surface. And if you get the color values right, it looks like those things. If you think about what it is, you're almost always going to be wrong, because we have all these prejudices, preconceptions about what things look like. Think about the fact now, maybe hopefully they're out of style now, but for years, most manufacturers had a whole line of colors that they called flesh tone. Do you remember that, Jordan? Have you seen those?
Yeah, they still do to some degree, but now that Crayola has like a box full of flesh tones, and it's all the flesh tones in the world. So I think we're moving away from that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Grumbacher used to have flesh tone number 1, flesh tone number 2, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think anything human ever looked like these things. They all looked like Barbie, you know? It was someone's idea of what flesh tone looks like. If you look at a model in daylight, you know, you think about a Velázquez or a Vermeer painting, and you really analyze what those color values are. There can be subtle grays and purples and tans and things that are so far away from, you know, the sort of pinky, orangey flesh tone that most people think about. So again, you don't want to concentrate on what it is that you're painting. You want to concentrate on how does it appear? What does it look like? Hawthorne has a great analogy. He says that we all know that a piece of coal is dark and the open white pages of a book are light, right? We all know this. But he said, if I take that piece of coal and put it out in the direct sun, and I take the open white pages of a book and put it in deep shadow, the coal may very well be lighter value than the book. And that is mind-blowing when you get it, because everybody wants to make the coal dark and the book white, lighter. But really, if you look at how they're lit, they could be flip-flopped. And if you don't respond to that, the reality of your observation is just not going to be there. So you have to keep your mind very open. I think of, I never premix values because I want to be surprised, you know, I want to look at something and go, I didn't expect to see a purple there, but there it is. So I'll go ahead and register that observation. I want to be surprised. I want to be taken, you know, back by what I'm seeing. If you thought you knew what everything looked like, there wouldn't be as much impetus to paint the painting, I think, because I think about the whole thing as really an exploration of what it is you're seeing, and you're recording your observations of that situation. All right, let's look at the next one.
May I ask, since you're not on site when you make the bigger paintings, what are your references?
My references are all those small studies that I used. That's basically it. I mean, I do have color photographs, but like I said, I don't always trust them. You know, I'm particularly suspicious of color in photographs, but you can say, well, I don't know the exact color, but I can see from this that this is cooler and that is warmer. You know, you may not be able to know exactly how much, but it gives you some information. For me, the photographs are very useful for information. Like, this building has 16 windows. And in this building, there's 3 chimneys on one side and 2 chimneys on the other side, and they're this tall, you know, that sort of thing I get. I'm very confident that I can use from photographs. But with photographs, think about this situation. If you take a photograph of a row of trees against a sky with clouds in it, right? If you focus on the trees so that you can get information about the trees, the sky comes completely bleached. It basically becomes just white. If you focus on the sky so you can see the clouds, the row of trees becomes a dark silhouette. The camera has to choose one or the other, because it's just registering this flood of light, where with us, our brains are able to toggle back and forth from one to the other, and first look at this, then look at this, and compare the two and put the two things together. Cameras generally can't do that. Now, what you could do is you could, you know, take one picture of the clouds in focus, one picture of the trees in focus, and then you can combine those things. But the point is, the camera has to do certain things with limitations in it that our eyes don't, you know? So that's why I trust my eyes much more than photographs. So anyway, I've kept working down to get that second row of buildings. And if you look at the rooftops, and I gotta say, it was so exciting to me to see all these planes, you know, at different angles. It was like looking at an early Braque Cubist painting, you know, all of these great trapezoids at slightly different angles, all sort of fitting together and then breaking apart in some ways. But if you look at that lower set of roofs, look at, everyone has a different color value. No two of those roofs are the same. And then within each basic color, there are certain subcolors. In this case, it's from the weather and, you know, detritus falling down the roof and things like that. But whatever made it that way, I'm just recording what I see. And again, I think if you record it honestly and accurately, you'll get a abiding sense of reality in your paintings. You know, a lot of times I see a color and I say, that can't be. And then I look at it and it is. And I've learned to trust myself and put it down and not censor it. We like to censor observations and put them in a box and say, oh no, people are like this, animals are like this, clouds are like this. But they can really be way outside those intellectual boundaries that we have for things. And here again, I'm moving downward because those greens are sandwiched in between the orange browns of the roof. And that's very important that your eye vibrate that way. All right, let's look at the next. And the painting just kind of kept expanding that way. And this is how I ended up leaving it. So you can see the painting starts out with a small nucleus and then basically mushrooms out from there. And one of the things you have to learn to do in color spot painting, in addition to, you know, really getting the right color value, is you have to learn to know where to go, what direction to go in. People always ask, well, what should I do now? You know, and you always want to move towards an area that gives you more color information, you know, that tells you more about what's going on. If you stay in an area that's all the same, that may be true in the painting, but you're not learning anything. So it's not a good place to be, particularly at the beginning. You want to go to a place that's going to teach you something about the key and the range of the painting. So I think you getting a sense of how I paint these paintings, you can see how different it is from the way that many people paint, which is what I would call all over, all at once, right? Most people establish a general color, and then they start putting down lights, separating lights and darks and warms and cools. And in point of fact, none of those color values is correct. You're just establishing basic fields, and then you're gonna hone in on it, and change those things. But the point is that you're spending an awful lot of time with a painting that's in a state that it's not going to be in ultimately. And you can say, well, there's probably more chance for error in that situation than in this situation, because I know that everything I put down is correct. Assuming you've got the hang of this, everything is correct and it acts as a building block. So everything is truthful. Whereas if you paint sort of in the traditional all over, all at once, you could be working on a painting for a month and still nothing in the painting is the way that it's ultimately going to be. So it's a kind of a different way of painting. And I think for most people, you have to get used to it, because most people paint all over, all at once. When people talk about old master painting, that's really what they're talking about. They're not talking about this. Although, like I said, there are any number of painters who've painted color spot paintings or paintings with color spot areas in them. Now, one of the great contemporary color spot painters is Lucian Freud. And if you've looked at any of his unfinished paintings, you'll see he's doing a portrait, he starts in with an eye, just an eye, and then moves over to the nose, and then eventually there's the mouth, and then some of the hair, and he's painting exactly like this. So it's not unheard of, it's just unusual. All right, let's go to the next one. So when I was in Samur, we were staying in this beautiful room that had these, French windows and this view. That's the bridge that you see in the painting. And I came in one day and my wife had been sitting in this chair looking out the window. And I was just really taken with that sort of image of the chair by the window. When you paint a chair like that, it's an invitation to the viewer to sit and look out. And if you have a figure in the chair looking out like you would in a Caspar David Friedrich painting or something like that, looking at somebody's back who's then looking out at something else is a very complex set of emotional relationships. But having the empty chair there allows you to feel like, well, I could go and sit in that chair. And if I did, I would get to see more of that beautiful view of which I'm just getting a hint right now. So anyway, I did a number of interiors. I think there's another one after this, Jordan. Yeah. So this one, I worked from a slightly different angle, and it's a grayer day. There's not the same kind of direct light. And I also changed the aspect ratio of the painting. So this one is very long and thin. I think it's 60 by 30. So it's twice as high as it is wide. And I wanted in this one to really get the sense of the elegance of those windows. And, windows always function as a kind of viewfinder, right? I don't know how many of you use viewfinders, but they're very, very important tool for figuring out how you want to compose something. I always walk around with a viewfinder, and windows function as viewfinders. So you can, for instance, you're going around somebody's house and you're looking outside and you're thinking, well, this is sort of interesting, but not really. And then you go inside and you see the same view through the window. It becomes much more exciting, because it's already been framed and composed in a certain way. So it's practically art already when you look at something through a window. So paintings like this, I find very moving for that reason. All right, let's look at the next one. So here's another view of the same town, but this was a second year that I went back at a much later date. So it was much cooler, and it had that fall intensity to the blue. And I was there at a period of just incredible calm, you know? And so the canal had what the oceanographers called sea state zero. In other words, there were no perturbations in the water at all. It just functioned like a mirror. So there was this real town and this reflected town, you know, right next to each other. And of course, none of it is real. That's the interesting thing. But when you see a reflection in a painting, it's like a double layer of unreality, right? Because none of it, the real, quote unquote, real town is not actually real either. But this adds another layer of things. And the fact that what you see up there and what you see down there are related. And I think it's very musical in a sense. This is kind of a musical line. You think, dum 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 dum, right? They mirror each other, those musical lines. So the abstraction of it, I think, is very, very important. All right, next. This is a huge painting that I did when I got home. It's, yeah, I'm gonna say it's 68 by almost 50, something like that. And it's of a just beautiful chateau that we were able to stay at that had just the most extraordinary views out over the countryside, including, you know, vineyards, 2 or 3 canals, whatever Burgundy had to offer, there it was. And the way the clouds gathered on the horizon line each morning was just incredible to me. So anyway, I did a number of small studies of this. And then when I got home, I worked up this big piece. Now, I think I have a couple of the studies. So let's look at the next one. Okay, so this is actually a piece that I did on site. And in this one, I'm actually down on the ground. So do you see how much of the countryside you see? Not all that much, a sliver of a couple of inches, right? Jordan, if we could go back to the previous one. Now look at that. Do you see how much more of the landscape you see? Well, what I did was I climbed up onto the roof of a building opposite this. So I was much higher and I could see way out. And I loved the drama of that. So sometimes, you know, we talk about finding your station point in terms of usually going right to left or back and forward, but up and down is an incredible thing too. Jordan, I don't know if you remember, but at MICA, one of the drawing studios had this huge plexiglass cube that was like 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet.
Which building?
It was on the first floor when you walked in the old building, and it was way to the back behind the staircase. And I forget the name of the guy whose studio it was, but he did figure drawing. And anyway, he would sometimes put the model like up on top of the cube, and the students went into the cube and looked at the model from the feet up, or vice versa. The students would go on top of the cube and the model would be down low in it. Anyway, it was amazing experience of changing your point of view vertically rather than horizontally.
It might have been Dan Dudrow or Hayes Friedman.
Yeah.
Michael
Anyway.
Economos.
Who was the last one?
Michael Economos.
That's him. Economos. Yeah.
He taught me a lot.
He was one of the few big anatomy guys there. Yeah.
While we're looking at this painting, I had a quick question. Actually, 2 questions. One, were you thinking about Lopez Garcia in this kind of perspective of looking out? And the second one is, would you mind talking briefly about kind of the painter's relationship to the color green and the difficulties that you have to kind of juggle with painting that color?
Yeah, green is really tough. Green is really tough. And it's taken me a long time to really pay tribute to the incredible variety of greens and yet keep them in control. because there's something about green. I don't know what it is, but I mean, because it's prevalent in North America, right? I mean, we have so much green. You know, if you buy pastels, they ask you, do you want the portrait set or do you want the landscape set? And the landscape set has all these greens, blues and greens. And I'm thinking, well, that's fine if you're on the East Coast, but let's say you're out in Arizona. You'd be better off with the portrait set, you know, with all the browns and grays and tans. Anyway, greens are really, really difficult. And you can, you know, with viridian and cadmium yellow and your other colors, blues and browns, you can replicate a good number of greens, but really I found over the years, there's nothing like having a really good assortment of greens out of the tube. You know, if you think of something like Terre Verte as being your kind of basic workhorse green, like you see in nature, you know, most dark aspects of trees in the shadow are a kind of a Terre Verte. If you have, olive trees, they're much grayer, so you have to add black or purple and white or something like that. And if you take that Terre Verte as being your sort of, let's say, middle green, then you can say, well, this green is much yellower, and this green is much cooler, and this green is grayer, and this green is browner. And learning to A, distinguish those things, and B, figure out what you have to do to get there. And that just takes a lot of experimenting. And what I did was I took each of my greens, like a viridian. Now you compare viridian to Terre Verte, viridian is much bluer, you know, and much more intense. It's like an English racing green or something like that. You don't see it in nature quite that much. The second you mix viridian with a cadmium yellow, it becomes a beautiful bright yellow like you'd see with trees in the sunlight or something. So I take viridian and I mix it with all these different colors to see what I would get. And I'd mix it with all these, you know, different amounts of white, for instance. And I basically made color strips of all of my greens, mixing them with all of the other colors and different values, so I could see what happened to them. And it just spent years just looking at all those greens. So on my palette now, I have a viridian green, which is, again, a very bright, cool green, very intense color. I have a phthalo green, which I almost never use. It's a really powerful, very dark. And it's really good to have colors that are dark out of the tube. And I'll tell you why. Like, if you have a choice between, you could only have one, cadmium red light or cadmium red deep, I would take the deep, because trying to make a red darker is really hard. Think about it. You know, you're painting a tomato and the light side might be, you know, close to cadmium red light, but the dark side, what is that? Well, you add black to it, you get this kind of mushy brown. You add blue to it, you get a purple. You add green to it, they cancel each other out, and you get this brown gray mush. Like, how do you darken a red and make it not something very weird? So if you have a red that's already dark out of the tube, you're a step ahead, I think. So I would always go, because it's easy to add yellow to it, yellow and white, and make it lighter, but I think it's much harder to darken things. So if I ever have a choice, cobalt comes in light and dark, I would always take the dark. Anyway, so yeah, so I have a viridian, a phthalo, I have Terre Verte, I have a color called sap green, which is a much yellowy sort of middle dark green. I have then a trio of very light yellowy greens. Like, if you ever painted a tree against the sunlight, so the sunlight's coming through the leaves and it makes this really bright yellow kind of color. again, I find that very hard to replicate myself if I only had one green and one yellow. So I believe the colors are cinnabar green, cadmium green, and then Old Holland makes a color called yellow green light. And it's kind of not helpful in terms of what it is. And only Old Holland makes it. So I find sometimes when I'm trying to decide what brand of paint to buy, I go with, what color values I need. There aren't a lot of companies that make really dark cad red dark. A lot of the cad red darks that are made now are not really all that dark, but Williamsburg, Winsor and Newton make really dark, rich cadmium red darks. So anyway, so I have those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 greens on my palette, which I never used to have when I was younger. But I think I can just get a lot more and keep it in control. John Constable, the English landscape painter, was one of the few people who really tried to paint the number of greens that there were. And he paid a terrible price for it. He lived at a time when English painting, particularly landscape painting, they were all sort of enamored of Rembrandt. Think of the Polish Rider. That landscape is brown soup, and everybody thought landscapes were basically brown. So Constable painted greens the way that he saw them, not brown at all. And people called it, someone referred to one of his paintings as that nasty green thing, because greens can get out of control. And apparently one of his sponsors said to him, John, a landscape should be the color of a Cremona fiddle. That's how brown it should be. And apparently Constable took his fiddle and threw it out onto the lawn and said, now you tell me. Anyway, so this is one of the smaller pieces that I did when I was over there. And you can see, if you look carefully, do you see the seams? There's one about a quarter of the way on the right-hand side. Then there's one right in the middle of the painting. Then there's a horizontal one. Yeah. So this was pieced together. At first, I thought I was only going to do the section on the left, a little part of the house, and then the landscape. And then I said, you know what, it could use some more. So I took out another canvas and I taped it onto it, and then another canvas, and it just sort of got bigger as I was going along. If you look at the next slide, Jordan, yeah, there you go. So you can see how I'm decided to change the orientation of this whole thing and make it a much bigger painting than when it started. And you can see when I got home, I had this one long sliver at the top of the painting. It needed about 3 inches of sky all the way across. So I had to cut a piece of canvas exactly right. And then I handed it over to a great panel maker I know who cut the panel, the birch panel, and then glued all of the separate pieces down onto the panel. And that's how the painting worked. But anyway, so that's my palette, you can see. And at the very bottom there, you just get a taste of the number of greens that I have there. Now, sometimes when I'm traveling, I don't take all of those greens, but I take as many as I can fit. Well, this is as good a place as any to stop.
Can I ask a question about, it came in the chat, and when you do pastels, do you also use this approach of color spot?
Yes. Yes. And my pastels are unusual. If you flip ahead quickly, Jordan, you'll hit a couple of pastels. Keep going. There you go. Okay, here's one. So this is actually almost life size. It's the piece of paper is like 70 inches, something like that. And you can see it's basically done exactly the same way. And my pastels are, again, they're unusual in that sort of true bona fide pastelists have certain rules for themselves, like they don't mix like oil paints. They layer. So if you want a green, you put down a blue with strokes, and then you put down yellow strokes on top of it, and your eye mixes the thing. Whereas I came out of an oil painting tradition, so I just take a cloth and I mix them up into a green the way I would in oil painting. So anyway, yes, I work almost exactly the same way in pastels. Well, anyway.
we did ask quite a few questions during the presentation, so but thank you.
Accolades are coming in through the chat too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again for having me, Jordan.
Always. It's such a
This was
pleasure.
fantastic. And Jordan, we have to invite him for workshops, please.
Oh, absolutely. I'll definitely be taking it again. Every time you speak and every time that I get to work in the classroom setting with Ephraim, I definitely learn or relearn things that I may have missed in my earlier years. So it's education never stops, really. So it's important to keep taking classes.
Yep. Yeah. And
I still try and do the color spot painting. And then in the show that's at Glen Echo Park, there's a bunch of figurative work in that vein, although I was more leaning towards Hawthorne and not drawing at all, just kind of putting the color exactly where I thought it would belong. I guess I read it a little too closely when I read Hawthorne's book a few times.
Well, for those of you who want to read a little bit about this, Hawthorne, there's a book by Hawthorne called Hawthorne on Painting. And it's actually, when Hawthorne died, a lot of his students sent their reminiscences of the class and things that Hawthorne said to them over the years. And the widow collected them and put them in this book, which is one of the most inspirational books about painting. So if you can get a hold of Hawthorne on Painting, it's a Dover reprint, fairly inexpensive, but it'll reiterate a lot of this.
I really wish they put the paintings with what they were saying in there, though.
Yes, I know.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
well, thank you again, Ephraim, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you
so much.
This was
just wonderful. Thank you so much. God bless. Fantastic.
And if anyone's still around, the opening reception at my show is tonight at 6 to 8. You can brave the wind. It'll be wonderful.
Yes.
Self-plug. Anyway. All right. Thanks, Mariana. Thanks, everybody.